Hey everyone, this is Mike FITZ with explore.org. Thanks for joining me today. It is Labor Day, September 6th, 2021, and this is a Brooks River play-by-play. I'm joined today with my co-host from Katmai National Park, Ranger Naomi Boak. Naomi, thanks so much for being here.
Oh, it's great. And what a happy Labor Day to join you. I love doing these play-by-plays with you.
Yeah, it looks like you have some fantastic weather today, and we're gonna, I think, enjoy a lot of great scenes of the Bears, including this spring cub. We're gonna get back to this spring cub in just a little bit, but let me introduce everyone to the river and what we'll be looking at during the broadcast today. So we'll be looking at the Brooks Falls camera. We'll also be headed downstream to the lower river scene, and this is River Watch Cam, as we call it, on the main website, so you can check there from time to time to see what the Bears are doing. This is about a kilometer from Brooks Falls, and then right near there, we'll also be going underwater to take a look at the salmon and talk about them. This is a live broadcast. It's a play-by-play. We never really know what's going to happen during the broadcast. So that's one of the things I believe that makes it interesting overall. But if you're not familiar with Brooks River and its location, let's send you on a quick tour here. So Brooks River is located about 300 miles southwest of Anchorage, Alaska. It's in the northern section of the Alaska Peninsula, so that arc of land jutting off towards the Aleutian Islands. Brooks River is about 1.5 miles long, and it's bisected by Brooks Falls. And along with our webcam partner, the National Park Service, explore.org hosts and maintains several webcams along Brooks River. The signal from the cams has to be sent wirelessly out of the Brooks River area. Brooks River is only accessible by plane or boat. So the signal is sent to some radio repeaters on top of Dumpling Mountain, and then those send the signal to the small town of King Salmon about 30 miles away, and that's where they get uploaded to the rest of the internet. Going back to the river just real quick here again to highlight where we'll be on the Brooks Falls cam frequently during this broadcast, so that's on the left side of your screen, and then we'll be downstream again about 1 kilometer to the River Watch camera and the underwater camera as well. And Naomi, it looks like it's a busy day there at the river overall. I haven't had too much time to watch specifically today because I was trying to take some time off to go outside and just enjoy the forest near my house. But when I came back late this afternoon and checked into the bear cams, it looks like there was a lot of stuff going on.
Yeah, there is. And wasn't so much this morning. It was really just one bear in the jacuzzi, I believe, Bear 503, who looks like he's there now. But yeah, lots of great activity. There's been a lot of activity on the lower river as well. I had a lot of great bear watching on the lower river yesterday.
And the falls really does take capture the bulk of the public's attention. But the lower river at this time of the year really is a great place to watch brown bears. The activity is a bit dispersed because salmon aren't concentrated in any one spot necessarily. As we look across Brooks River, this view right now is looking south. You're looking at the elevated bridge across the river itself. So salmon are dispersed throughout this area, and there's a lot of dead and dying salmon that are starting to accumulate down here. So you'll see many bears kind of moving back and forth, patrolling this area, looking for anything that can't swim away. And I think we'll get an opportunity to see some of that behavior a little bit on in the broadcast. But Naomi, you've also been talking about how you've had the opportunity to watch this family group frequently over the last several days. This is 909 and her first-year cub. What have you been seeing them doing?
Well, yesterday evening, she and her cub were on the bank of the lower river, just below the bridge, and doing a little grazing and finding some scraps of salmon and doing a little cuddling. It was very sweet. And 909's sister, 910, was swimming nearby in the lagoon. And they looked great. And then after a little while, I could hear that the cub was nursing in the trees there. I couldn't see them, but I could hear them. So they've been in the lower river a lot, and right now seeing at the falls. And 909 is a bear who does very well on the lip, but she hasn't had a lot of access to the lip. So she's right now looking for, trying to figure out a good way to fish.
And she's gained quite a bit of body mass since early summer. Although she's not as bulky as some of the other bears overall, and that's kind of expected because she is a first-time mother, and she's a younger bear, so she's not necessarily able to find access to like the most preferred fishing spots on a regular basis. And then, of course, taking care of a cub and raising a cub and making sure that it's well cared for and well fed, it takes a lot of energy. But 909 seems to be doing pretty well overall. Naomi, this is a photo that you took just a few days ago, and that cub is pretty pudgy. I must say that I bet I would be surprised if that cub didn't weigh close to 60 pounds right now. I bet it's pretty big.
Yeah, it's definitely a butterball. I took that photo last night, and the other heartening thing, well, two heartening things. One is that 909 here you can see how she is pudgy, and I think that's great. She hasn't had access to her favorite fishing spot. She's been taking care of that cub, and the fact that she was nursing last night. All those are good signs.
And at this time of the year, with first year cubs, their digestive system is at a point where it's mature enough to survive off of foods without mother's milk. At the beginning of their lives, however, really their digestive tract is just primed to survive on mother's milk, and that's really the only food available to them. And really, for the first 4, maybe 5 months of their life, milk is the most important food source for them, and it's still very important um, for the cub right now. But it's able to, if it happened to be separated from mother accidentally for whatever reason, it could survive eating salmon. It wouldn't necessarily need mother's milk, but milk is still a very important food source for the young spring cub. And it's also important to note, Naomi, that these cubs, when they go into their dens for their first full winter, they're not nursing in the den, so their metabolism, their physiology is switched over to that hibernation mode, just like mom. So they need to accumulate a great amount of fat reserves to survive the long winter that's coming up.
This year, one thing that I have observed is all the cubs we've seen here have really looked healthy and fat. Now, this is the only spring cub that has been in camp recently. We haven't, the other family groups with spring cubs have not been around.
And maybe we'll get the opportunity to see some of those cubs or those other family groups during the broadcast if we get lucky. If you're wondering, what the size difference might be between a spring cub and yearlings, let's cut to another photo, Naomi, that you took of Divot and her cubs, so you can see just how much larger second year cubs are compared to spring cubs. And can you point out where mom is in this photo, Naomi?
Yeah, she is on the beach at Naknek Lake, which is not a view that you guys have on the cams. And she's almost at what was the corner. There really is not a corner this year because the water level is so high and things are flooded. But this family group has been in camp a lot. The other thing that's happening in this area on the beach is that she is and some other bears are fishing for some of the dead and dying salmon. It's very shallow along the edge of the beach this year, and they're combing the beach for fish.
And Divot is the bear on the left-hand side that's sort of facing the camera in a sense. So looking at these two yearlings, they're giant compared to spring cubs. They're probably well over 200 pounds at this time of the year. So even the young bears in Katmai National Park are quite large overall. But yeah, like you were saying, Naomi, it seems like the mothers are doing quite well with their cubs this year, even though that it seems like the salmon run was a little late in arriving at Brooks River. When it came, it was very strong, and it kept on going. And now we're seeing a lot of bears fishing successfully for at Brooks Falls, specifically for silver salmon, a smaller run of salmon that enters Brooks River, much smaller than the sockeye run. But it's at least keeping the bears occupied at Brooks Falls and providing them an opportunity to gain a lot of calories compared to eating dead and dying sockeye salmon, which aren't as energetic from a bear's perspective. The longer the salmon are in the freshwater, the more energy they expend and the less caloric they are for a brown bear. So they're going to try to eat the fresher fish whenever they can.
That's a very patient cub.
I always find it fascinating to watch the behavior of the cubs around mothers. When mom is nervous, you can tell. Even if you can't read her behavior, you can look at the cub and you can see that that's often the cubs express, some sort of stress. Might be like right next to mom. They might be leaning against her haunches, for instance. Um, Being as close to mother as possible, or they'll run up a tree if they feel stressed and threatened. Trees can be sanctuaries for them, but a cub just kind of relaxing on the bank here with other bears nearby too. That's kind of an interesting facet of this scenario that we're watching here, Naomi, is that there's plenty of bears in the river, but the cub doesn't seem to be stressed out about that at all. And mom is keeping a close watch. But it seems like, yeah, she's not particularly concerned about, any of those other bears coming and posing a direct threat to her cub at this moment in time, at least.
Well, we have to remember that 909 is a young mother. She's only 5 years old, and this was her first litter, and she's learning as she goes. So this cub it's kind of like being the child of a teenage mom. The child learns along with the mother, and this cub has had a lot of lessons. And I think of it when it's here because 909 has tried to tree that cub by the falls platform, and it does not like to be treed. It will come down to the bank. So it's and not all of the spring cubs are like that. So that's a behavior again that reminds us of bears being individuals, even when they're young.
We can certainly see those personalities developing in first year cubs, and certainly in yearlings. We'll see that frequently with yearling cubs. You'll see one might be a bit more bold than its sibling, for instance. So it'll be, I think, fun to watch this family as that cub matures. Now we're panning up, thanks to our camera operators who are working behind the scenes to give us a view. I'm going to try to cut down to the underwater camera because we have a bear swimming right towards it, Naomi, and I don't want to miss this. So,
No,
I love this view. This is maybe my favorite view on the webcams.
Thank you for radioing that bear and telling it to come, Mike.
They do sometimes express a bit of curiosity towards that camera. I mean, it's attached to a piling on the bridge, but it's a silvery object that's conspicuous. Sometimes they'll see it and they'll kind of swat at it, or they'll grab onto it, maybe as they're trying to hold their position in the current. But yeah, I love watching the bears swim by the underwater camera. They're very strong swimmers, as we got, I think, a really great example of right there. They're designed just like a dog in their body plan, so their nostrils kind of sit above the water, so that makes it easy for them to swim. But they often don't use their rear legs. I mean, it's really just kind of like their arms that they're paddling with, and they're very buoyant. So it seems like they move through the water with ease.
The other thing that you notice is that bear was kind of standing swimming, and when you're watching the lower river, you'll notice that a lot because they really there aren't a lot of dead and dying salmon there yet, so they're really on the lookout for fish, and unless they're going to dive, it's a little tough to fish there right now. So you'll see a lot of bears on their kind of half swimming, half standing down there.
And the water here is actually very deep. It's difficult to tell on the camera, but I bet it's close to 8 feet deep there. or at least 6 feet. It's over my head. I'll just say that. So, but it is quite deep in that spot. It's just a little hard to get the sense of a sense of the water depth just by watching the underwater camera.
I think it actually may be deeper than that this year. Very deep water this year. And there are some
And maybe
salmon
that's
hanging out there.
yep, and maybe that's one reason why we're seeing not, bears utilizing other parts of the river more frequently. The falls has been a spot where we've seen bears fishing basically every day since the end of June, and it's kind of remarkable. I know of no other river on the planet that offers bears the opportunity to fish for salmon for so long, months at a time. Most other places allow bears to fish for salmon for a short window, a couple of weeks or something like that, uh, maybe 3 weeks or a month. But Brooks River is really kind of unique in that sense, and we're getting, I think, just a grand show this year overall. And a good look here,
Yeah.
Naomi, of some of the big adult males at the falls. 151 on the lip there, 503 in the jacuzzi. The bear near the boulders, maybe 812, I'm not sure. And then you thought in the far pool you saw 856 return today.
Yeah. You can see those ears, right? And that's his preferred spot these days. So I'm pretty sure that's 856. And I know the cam viewers will correct me if I'm wrong, but that is his preferred spot. I think it's very interesting that Walker 151 is there right now because he seems to have a pattern of really not fishing the lip until really late season, late summer, early fall. And I think maybe, I don't know, Mike, maybe because it's a little safer for him there in terms of his place in the hierarchy. He seems to gain his bulk in other places, again, in the far pool or in the riffles. Of course, right now, if that's 856, he does not have access to the far pool, I would guess.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Walker, he's good at fishing the lip of the falls, but we don't see him up there all the time. And we've seen him most frequently over the past, couple of weeks or so in the far pool vicinity. So I think perhaps the competition posed by 856 over there, who is a more dominant bear than 151, even though they're not that different in size anymore. But I think 856's presence over there in the far pool is enough to give Walker, you know, to make him hesitant, I should say, to approach that vicinity. We had been seeing him over there frequently. 747 chased him out there a few times. Another one of the very dominant bears that we have here at Brooks River. But maybe right now Walker's just like, yeah, you know what? I'm just going to go to the lip. There's more space for me up here, and I'm less likely to face challenges from some of these other really big and dominant adult males at the falls.
And again, that pixelated bear in the back caught a fish.
Yeah, and that almost certainly was a silver, sometimes called a coho salmon. Those are the salmon that arrive in Brooks River typically in August. Their run is smaller than the sockeye. Several 100,000 sockeye salmon will move through Brooks River. We don't really know how many silver salmon will move through, but it could be a few thousand, a few tens of thousands. We're not really sure. No one keeps close counts of those. They're not fished for in the Naknek River, the greater watershed, commercially like sockeye salmon are. So we don't have a great idea, but some years it can be quite strong, and it'll keep the bears well fed. They're big salmon overall. They're maybe 8-10 pounds, or more. So they're a good meal for a brown bear. And when you look at Walker here, Naomi, he's fat.
He's huge.
to,
He's huge.
to put it
I mean,
succinctly.
I'm looking at him and thinking what I've been thinking about the bears that I've seen at the falls recently, which is because I'm out there thinking about Fat Bear Week pictures. We could use these pictures for Fat Bear Week because I believe he is bigger now than he was in late September last year. And I have a picture of 747 from 2 weeks ago, and I compared it to one from late fall last year, and I am convinced 747 is bigger this right now in the beginning of September than he was in late September last year.
Yeah, these are some of the biggest bears on the planet. So the bear we mentioned before, 747, was estimated to weigh about 1,400 pounds last year. So he's basically in like the top 1% of all brown and grizzly bears on Earth as far as body mass goes. Walker is a big guy. He, I think last year was somewhere around 1,100 pounds or so, if I remember right, Naomi. I don't know if you remember those stats off the
Yeah,
top of your head.
I do. 1,100 was our guesstimate.
And let's throw up a picture here of Walker in, uh, let's see, this is July 8th, 2021. So not that long ago, 2 months ago, he was a fat bear then, but he certainly has gained quite a bit of body weight since then. He's a big guy overall, and with brown bears, I mean that's a sign of success. You know, when we talk about bears and how fat they are, when bears are fat, that is a sign of their overall health and how well they're doing over the course of the summer, and that's going to allow them to survive through winter hibernation and also the springtime season when there's not a lot of food available to them.
Yeah, there are big bears out there right now. Mike, do you think that is 812? I see some lip licking, which is indicative of that bear.
Yeah, the bear right in the center of our screen really does look like 812 to me. He's a young adult male. And he's kind of one of those younger males that we've seen expressing a lot of playfulness in the past and tolerance for other bears. Kind of a lot like some of the more dominant bears that we see at the falls right now, for instance, like Walker, who we were watching on the lip of the falls, and even 856. I had watched him play as a younger adult with other bears, but now he's a very dominant bear, and it looks like maybe 812 here is eyeing 856 and wondering just for a second whether 856 was going to come in his direction. But now 856 caught another salmon. He's going to go eat it back in the corner there, keep it to himself, of course. And that gives maybe these other bears just a little bit more space.
You don't think 856 is going to share, huh?
No.
So,
But looking
I
at, sorry,
well, I just want
finish
to
your
say
thought, please.
I have a picture that you have of 812 to just get a good sense of his size. This is a 6-year-old bear, and he is really big. I mean, I he is so tall. He is almost as big as 503, who is they're both were cubs of bear 402. 812 is 2 years younger than 503. 503 is still bigger, but this is a very big bear for 6 years old.
And he's coming of age during a time when salmon runs in this watershed have been very strong. And you don't get as big as these bears without having a lot of food to eat. And so it's been remarkable to see how A12 has grown so quickly over the years. And he, again, like some of the other young adults that we have at Brooks Falls, he has the potential to be a very large bear in the future. So if you are watching the cams now and you're interested in following the hierarchy as we go into 2022 and 2023 and years into the future, I think we can expect to see, some of these very large adult males like 856 eventually take a step back as they face competition from some of these up and coming younger bears like 812, bears like 503. We could essentially see, a changing of the guard as far as generations go over the next several years. 856 has been the river's most consistently dominant bear really since 2011. And he's been at the tippy top of the hierarchy until pretty much this year. And and he took a step back to 747, but he's still a very dominant bear. But that doesn't mean that's guaranteed for the future. So bears like 8112 might avoid him right now, but 8112 is doing very well for himself, and looks like he has a nice coho salmon there to enjoy.
Yeah, a nice big one. Also interesting to watch is 812. Again, 812's behavior around some of the other bears, especially 503. He's had to modify his behavior because, um, uh, especially with 503, because 503 is not as tolerant of other bears as he has been. For those of you who've watched the cams, 503 it has been a very social bear, likes to play with other bears. And when I've been up at the falls recently, he has not allowed 812 to get near him. Now, that may be because 503 is maturing, and it also may be because there's not as much salmon around.
Yeah, the personalities and dispositions that some of these bears express when they're younger isn't necessarily indicative of what they're going to be like as they mature into fully grown adult bears. So 812 could be it could behave very differently as he matures into a fully grown adult, and that won't really be until he reaches like 12 or 13 years of age. And even beyond that, he'll still gain body mass, even though he might not be growing any taller or longer. He'll still be able to gain body mass in this food rich environment that we have here in the central portion of Katmai National Park. So, 812, a young bear, still has a ton of growing to do, and I'm looking forward to seeing just how big he can get in the future. And looking at his brother from a different litter right here, number 503, probably eating a silver salmon as well that he caught in the jacuzzi.
He is. He really loves to be in that jacuzzi. I did get a glimpse of him for a moment the other night when he took his fish um, to eat it just under the fish ladder, and I thought that interesting for a bear his size, and taking it from the jacuzzi to behind the fish ladder.
And we're unlikely to see 503 out of the water, but he's also gained a significant amount of body mass too. So let's take a look at him back. This is early July. This is July 2nd of this year. So 503, very long-legged bear. He has a large frame, but he's not particularly well filled in. It seems like he's been putting a lot of energy into growing long and tall, but not necessarily wide like some of the other bears. But I think that'll change again as he matures into a fully grown adult. He was born in 2013. So again, he's not a very old bear overall. And I think we can see him or expect to see him growing much, much larger in the future. One of the things that I like watching about 503 too is his skills in different fishing spots. He can fish in the areas near the far pool. He can fish in the jacuzzi. Occasionally, we'll see him kind of hang out on the lip of the waterfall. So, in a way, Naomi. He's a bit of a generalist. But I also kind of remember some other bears being generalists in their younger days too. They try different techniques out. Sometimes they're faced with competition for more dominant bears in some maybe places that they want to fish at. So as they get into young adulthood, though, it seems like they're able to hold their position in these very productive fishing spots more often. For example, you don't really see 856 go to the lip of the waterfall or 747 go there. They really seem to stick to the productive fishing spots downstream of the falls.
Yeah, and it is, speaks again to the adaptability of these bears. I mean, this year when it's been very crowded at the falls, there have been some very creative fishing techniques. Looks
909
like
and her spring cubs still, yeah, still on the near bank here.
mhm. Looks like the cub has
And
found
that's
something either to eat or play with.
Cubs are extremely curious. I mean, I think that's one of the things that we enjoy about watching them is for them, like, there's so much new in their world, especially first year Cubs when they're coming out of the den. They investigate pretty much anything that mother happens to pay attention to, uh, and they often will occupy themselves. Not every mother bear is playful with her cubs, especially even with a cub in a that's single that doesn't have siblings, I should say. So I don't recall seeing 909 playing with her cub. So sometimes the cub has to entertain itself in a sense. Naomi, have you seen 909 wrestling with her cub this year?
No, I haven't. And if you think about 909's history, I mean, she had has a sibling 910, and when those they were their mother was 409 bead nose, and when they were spring cubs, they played with each other constantly, and I don't remember seeing 409 playing with them. So, and I just don't see 909 playing with her cub. Even 128, when she's away from the falls and she's in camp, will be playful with her cubs.
And speaking of play, let's head down to our Riverwatch camera. So again, this is about a kilometer from Brooks Falls downstream. Uh, Good play fight going on here right now. Um, just two younger bears, perhaps independent juvenile bears, those bears that we call sub-adult bears, enjoying a good wrestling match here. And we see this frequently at this time of the year in the lower river area um, where bears are well fed and they kind of congregate together. Not at the same densities as what you find at Brooks Falls, but bears also can recognize each other from a distance. They kind of can see each other. I'm convinced they can recognize each other by sight, but also by their smell. They probably develop sort of a scent profile for many of the different bears and can recognize them on those individual levels. So they don't necessarily have to work out whether this is friend or foe anytime that they come into contact with one another. And it's great to see bears just kind of having fun
Yeah,
down in the mouth of the river.
yeah, it makes me very happy, and because also it is a sign of fall to see these young bears playing in the lower river, and we really haven't had that until very recently. So a sign of fall and a sign of some healthy bears.
And play fighting like this differs from real fighting because obviously the bears aren't trying to injure each other in this instance, but the movements aren't nearly as intense and violent. And fights usually don't last this long. Fights are usually very short in duration, although there can be exceptions. But in a fight, you would see bears biting and holding on, um, and tearing, with their claws into the flanks of the other bears. Uh, so so when you're watching the webcams, you can see the sort of like the gentle nature of play fights overall. Even though sometimes one bear may want to break it off, and the other one doesn't quite want to. It seems like I think the darker bear spotted a fish under the water, and its attention quickly turned to trying to capture any salmon that was down there, and the other bears, still wanted to play for a little bit, but that happened to break off the encounter.
I know. I mean, you can almost see their brains working. It's very funny. It's like, oh, okay. I guess we can't play anymore.
And we're a little more than halfway through our broadcast. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today, no matter where you happen to be around the world. It's September 6th. My name is Mike FITZ with Explore.org, and my co-host today for this play-by-play, talking about brown bears and salmon at Brooks River in Katmai National Park, Alaska, is Park Ranger Naomi Boak from Katmai National Park. We're taking a look at bears in different locations at Brooks River. This is near the mouth of Brooks River, about a kilometer downstream of Brooks Falls. And a great look once again up at Brooks Falls of 909's first year cub. that looks like, in the meantime, as we were watching those bears play fighting, has acquired a little bit of some salmon. I think maybe mom had moved in. Uh, Either she scavenged some fish or she was able to catch some of her own, and now her spring cub is gnawing on what remains of that.
Yeah, she's good. That cub is good at finding scraps on her own, with or without her mother. Speaking of scraps, Mike, I was thinking about this season and that we really didn't see a lot of high grading this year. And I'm I am guessing that maybe that's because the run was more sporadic than we're used to seeing in the last few years. So there would be a lot of salmon and then maybe some high grading, but then there'd be a pause and then more salmon. Did you notice that?
Well, certainly, I think back at the beginning of July, typically when we expect the salmon migration to peak, we weren't seeing as many fish as we had in recent years. And, a lot of people, including myself, has speculated whether the run was just late or if it was smaller. I'm not quite sure. Even though the overall salmon run in the larger watershed, the Naknek River watershed, was quite strong this year, not every portion of a watershed produces salmon at the same rate. So it's possible, yeah, that maybe production in the Brooks River system and upstream um, wasn't that great in prior years. So adult survival for whatever reason, or juvenile survival for whatever reason, wasn't that great in the Brooks River area. So less fish came back. I'm not sure. They could have been just late too. But when we didn't see a whole lot of those giant pulses of salmon like we had in recent years, so the bears certainly were eating more of the fish overall instead of just stripping the skin off, doing that high grading thing that you mentioned, stripping the skin off, eating the brains and eating the eggs, and leaving a lot of the fleshier parts behind. This might be a good time to take a moment to go underwater. We did take a look at the underwater camera earlier when a bear swam by, but a lot of salmon currently on the cameras. The salmon with the bright red bodies and green heads, those are sockeye salmon in their spawning colors. If you see any others, if you're watching the underwater camera, you see any other salmon swimming by that aren't the same in the same colors, if they happen to have spots on them, especially kind of greenish backs and pinkish sides, those will be the coho or silver salmon. Really good look at. It looks like a couple of males here that are just kind of posturing, swimming uh, broadside to one another. It's interesting, Naomi. There can be a dominance hierarchy that sets up on the spawning grounds with salmon, especially in high densities, where males are competing over access to nesting females. Females will choose a nesting site, and they will defend that nesting site from other females and kind of chase away some males that maybe they don't think are good suitors. But the males will compete quite vigorously for access to those females.
Oh, a bear. Thank you, bear.
That I guess that's why the salmon swam away, up close and personal with us.
Yes. Oh, and we're gonna have to clean the cam again.
Sometimes our underwater camera, the angle of it changes position, and sometimes that has to do. A lot of times it has to do with a bear that happens to grab onto it and just twist it to one side or the other.
I was just about to say that when I was on the riffles the other day, I did see some male sockeye uh, battling each other.
Okay, yeah, that doesn't surprise me. And fish that just swam by looked like maybe a whitefish. So that's not a salmon, but in this sort of like the same order of fish as salmon, but not, a different species, completely freshwater overall. So the underwater camera is one of the best ones to watch, in my opinion. Gives you a really unique perspective on the river, something that we can't see even when we're physically at the waterfall itself.
So, Mike, I have a question about the salmon.
Sure.
So when I'm on the bridge on the lower river and I'm seeing a great number of sockeye who that look like this, they're in their spawning colors, and which says a couple things to me. One, mainly that the salmon run really was late, and not just smaller. But I'm wondering, because it was late and I'm seeing all these fish in their spawning colors, are most of those not going to be jumping the falls?
They won't be. These fish that we see in the mouth of the river right now are going to probably move upstream to like the really great spawning habitat that is located between the falls and sort of the lower river area. But they don't feel the need typically to jump the falls. So they were spawned downstream in the falls. So they emerged from the gravel there, and that's where they realize that's their place to spawn. So they're not going to jump the falls. So those fish that we see generally down around the bridge area and on the underwater camera at this time of the year are just staging. They're waiting for the right time to move upstream to spawn in locations downstream of the falls. And every year, I think there's a few thousand fish that will do that. Back up at Brooks Falls, looking at again one of the more dominant bears on the river in the far pool there, number 856. Now transitioning to one of the fatter bears that we have on the river, approaching 856's size overall. Maybe not quite there yet, but this is 151 Walker. He definitely has those kind of big Mickey Mouse ears, Naomi, and a really pointed muzzle too. Those are a couple of the features that I use to identify him.
And his body shape is fairly unique.
Yeah, very light bulb shaped. Maybe the only other bear that kind of has that same light bulb that I know of is number 32 Chunk. We haven't seen him on the camera, but Chunk has a very today I should say we haven't seen him on the camera today, but Chunk has a very prominent muzzle scar. So if you're wondering, how to tell the difference between a few of these adult males, 856 kind of has blonder ears that often are kind of swept back in appearance. At least it looks like to me. 151 has those Mickey Mouse ears and a pointed muzzle, and then Chunk has a muzzle scar. So that's a few of the ways that you can tell some of these really big adult males apart.
And now you can see 812 standing a little bit, and you can kind of see how tall he is. He's got a fish.
The waterfall itself is about 6 feet high on average. So if you're seeing a bear standing, next to it, and it's not in a deep pool, that can give you a good indication of just how tall they are when standing on all fours. 856, for example, again, in the far pool, up against the wall there, eating another salmon. He's a very tall bear, Naomi. One of the tallest bears that I've ever seen. It looks like when you see him on the ground, it looks like at the shoulder. I mean, on all fours, I estimate he's probably about 5 feet tall.
Yeah, he is very tall. I mean, and the other thing, when you look at these bears and you were describing some of their physical characteristics, when we heard from Dr. Michael Saxton a few weeks ago, and he said in his research he found that this is a genetically um, healthy and diverse population, which you wouldn't think because we see the same bears mostly every year. But just looking at these bears and how their physical characteristics can be so different and varied speaks to that genetic diversity, I think.
Absolutely. This is a very healthy population. As far as size goes, the overall population is thought to, be at or near its carrying capacity for the habitat. It's also very healthy as far as genetics goes. And there could be more brown bears in Katmai National Park than all of the grizzlies combined in the contiguous 48 states. So at last estimate, and this estimate is more than 10 years old, uh, so I have to qualify this statement with that, but at last estimate, there was about 2,200 brown bears in thought to exist in Katmai National Park. So very rich and healthy population overall. And the thing that really supports, the high densities of bears here is or are the salmon. Uh, it's food resources. Denning habitats not in short supply. They don't face a lot of competition in the park from people. So they're largely living lives free of the conflict with people over space. And they have plenty of water, plenty of space overall. It's really just the amount of food in the ecosystem that determines carrying capacity for the bears here currently.
So, Mike,
Speaking
you
of
brought
food,
up, yeah, no, I had a question. You brought up grizzlies, and so they're the same species as brown bears, but we make a distinction between grizzlies and brown bears, and that distinction is mostly the kind of food and habitat they have. Can you talk a little bit more about that? And also, what's the difference in size between, say, a big grizzly in the lower 48 and one of our really large bears?
if I remember my statistics correctly, I think there was a book published by Frank Craighead about or John Craighead, one of the Craighead brothers who did some pioneering uh, grizzly bear studies in the Yellowstone ecosystem in the 1960s and in 1970s. And even during the days when bears were feeding on at dumps in Yellowstone, they never found a grizzly bear that was 900 pounds. So the potential is there, but they would really have to kind of sit at a at a very rich food resource and just eat and eat and eat. So the grizzly bears in the lower 48 generally have to work a lot harder for their food. Food resources are more dispersed. They're maybe less energy rich on average than salmon at a waterfall. For instance, you can think of like a pound of salmon versus a pound of berries. Berries are very high in sugar, very high in calories, but it takes more work to eat a pound of berries versus catching a salmon that swims right up to your face and you just kind of grab it like these bears are doing. So overall, the brown bears in Katmai and also the closely related Kodiak bears just across Shelikof Strait from Katmai are some of the largest bears in the world, averaging 700 to 900 pounds in midsummer. And then at this time of the year, we have many bears in Katmai National Park that are well over 1,000 pounds. And even the female bears in Katmai can be quite large, 600-700 pounds, and some of the biggest females that we have. 909, I don't think is approaching that. I think she's still kind of a small female. And again, she's the mother kind of in the middle of the frame right now with her spring cub is just on the near bank. But yeah, they're quite big. And then getting back to your first part of that question, about sort of like the differences between brown and grizzly bears. It's just not based on size, but also, geography. For the most part, people just consider brown bears to be those of the species, the scientific name Ursus arctos, that live in coastal regions of Alaska and British Columbia. And then grizzly bears live farther inland. So if you're at Denali, you're looking at a grizzly. If you're at Banff and in Jasper in Canada, you're looking at a grizzly. If you go to Yellowstone, you're looking at a grizzly. But the line really does kind of blur when you think about whether the bears, had access to coastal food resources in the past. Brown bears in California, for instance, would you have called those a brown bear or a grizzly bear? So again, it really just kind of depends on where you are overall. It looks like
So
909 is
looks
paying
like,
attention to something.
yeah, they're seeing something that's making them move. She smells something that makes her move.
It's possible there was another bear that walking in the vicinity. That would be the most likely thing. There's also people standing on the platform where the camera is attached. But the bears are used to seeing people on the platform there. So even sometimes, our conversations don't necessarily have an effect on them overall. But if you go to Brooks River and you're watching the bears from the platforms, it is prudent to keep your voices down so you can minimize the chance of disturbing those brown bears. And there is someone's boots there, so we know there is at least one person at the falls.
Yeah, there are a lot of visitors today. It looks to me looks like behavior of another bear being around. So something for us to look out for.
I agree. That definitely did seem like a reaction to the approach of another bear, even if we didn't happen to see it on the falls cam itself. We haven't seen too many interactions between between bears on the camera today, Naomi, but we did have a clip that I downloaded from August 31 that we can play right now to give people an idea of how bears are still interacting at this time of the year to assert their dominance. Um, so let's play that here for the last few minutes of our broadcast. This is from August 31st. The bear in, I think, the far pool here. We have two large adult males here in the far pool, number 747 and number 32 Chunk. Chunk's against the far wall here. And Naomi, you'll see Chunk avoid the approach of a bear that we've talked about a lot this evening, but we haven't seen live on the cameras, and that's number 747.
Yeah. And 747, I've noticed when he makes his entrance, he's making these dominance plays. He's now following Chunk.
Yeah, so Chunk really didn't want to stand his ground and defend that space against the approach of 747. These two bears have interacted frequently over the last several years, and Chunk has been consistently subordinate to 747. But now, as 747 kind of pushes this approach, Chunk maybe realizes that he can't run away or he risks getting attacked from behind. And we often see bears with like wounds on their rumps, probably from similar situations like that. So 747 in this instance really just did look like he wanted to affirm his dominance over Chunk once again. So he got in his face, backed him out of that fishing spot in the far pool. Now 747 is breaking off the encounter. And Naomi, when we see that happening, when we see one bear walking away from another bear, if it's not over a singular food resource, how can we tell who's the winner in that situation?
Well, we can tell the winner because that bear turns its back on the loser. It's confident enough to not look at the bear and just turn his back on it. I mean, I wouldn't turn my back on a bear that I would encounter on a trail. I want to see that bear. I want to know what it's thinking.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Often it's prudent to stand your ground in a close encounter with a brown bear. Sometimes it's safe to back away slowly in those encounters, but you definitely want to keep your eye on the bear and make sure that you are reading its behavior. And I found this interesting, Naomi, that Chunk kind of moved right back to a spot that he fishes at frequently. Seems like 747 was giving him just enough space, but this kind of wasn't the end of the encounter because 747 also wanted to display his dominance in a different way, not by getting necessarily in Chunk's face, but by standing up and rubbing his back on the rocks here, and also by kind of tearing into some willows that are growing off of the side of the cliff face.
I believe I was at the falls when this happened. I remember seeing that.
747 is a giant. He is a giant.
I was going to say that, yeah. I was going to say he used to like to do that on that tree, the late belated tree that was on the island. And now he's going back for Chunk.
Brown bears will mark trees as a display of dominance, but it also leaves scent behind. It helps to communicate things about their sex, their fitness, their reproductive status. But it's also when they're marking trees and just kind of tearing into branches in front of another bear, that's also a visual signal to the other bear that says, hey, I'm a big guy, I'm dominant, maybe you want to watch out. But you can see how Chunk here, started to move away when 747 approached once again, but then he stopped, held his ground, because again, he didn't want to necessarily expose, his flank to attack from 747. 747 moving towards Chunk in this situation, again, is a bold approach, and that's something that you'll see dominant bears do. Dominant bears will display an air of confidence when they're walking through the river, and Chunk does that when he's trying to displace other bears, but he won't do that in the vicinity of 747. He will not approach 747 because he knows that 747 isn't likely to yield in those situations, and he risks a physical fight if it comes to that.
Interesting. We haven't seen a lot of physical fights in the last 2 years.
And Fights between bears are pretty rare overall. Really knockout, drag out fights, intense fights. We often see them kind of swatting blows over a fishing spot occasionally, but yeah, we haven't seen a whole lot of real intense fights over the past several years. Most of their interactions kind of play out just like this, with the dominant bear just walking away, deciding, hey, I've sent my message to the other bear. He got the picture, and now, well, it's time for me to walk away and kind of assume my my preferred fishing spot, or if it was over access to a female who happens to be an estrus, maybe following her. But you'll still see some interactions between brown bears at the waterfall for dominance throughout the month of September. It doesn't happen as frequently as in July, when the bears were encountering one another for the first time, and they're still kind of sorting out the hierarchy. But it'll be interesting, Naomi, to see whether how Chunk interacts with 856, or how how 747 interacts with 856, who happens to be again in the far pool, because 856 is a very assertive bear, a very large bear, even though he has acted in yielded subordinate and yielded space to 747 earlier in the summer.
So I'm going to voice the female perspective here, which is, I think that the most significant dominant displays have been by some of the sows. 854 Divot has stood her ground with 747 and 151 Walker, and we certainly know that 128 Grazer has stood her ground. So we have two very dominant females who've been fishing here this year, and more, displaying more aggression at times than I would say most of the males. And speaking of moving bears out, I think this is maybe why 909 left.
Could be. Certainly could be. So you can see sort of like there's always like almost like a do-si-do happening with a lot of these bears. Those shuffle positions, one bear will move into the far pool, for instance, and that really just kind of causes a cascade of effects, and bears will just avoid the approach of those larger bears. And this does look like 747 moving into that far pool, Naomi. I'm curious to see if 856 reacts, or 747 looks like he's just going to assume one of his preferred fishing spots downstream of the boulders there.
Interesting, because when 909 stuck her nose in the air and decided to leave, my first thought is 747 must be approaching. And there he is in all his glory.
Yeah, in the far pool there, and really on our screen right now, two very large brown bears in the far pool. 747 looking and acting a little bit hungry. Maybe he hasn't had a good meal today so far. You often don't see him so animated when he's looking for salmon in the far pool.
Yeah, he must be hungry. And again, he's so big.
He is a giant. He'll be a tough bear to beat in our annual Fat Bear Week competition, which is coming up at the end of the month. Fat Bear Week begins September 29, and you get to vote for the bear who you think is the most successful and fattest bear of the year, as seen on our webcams at Brooks River. If you want to learn more about that, just go to fatbearweek.org and you can find more information about that. Naomi, we just have about a minute left in our broadcast here, but what can viewers expect as they continue to watch the webcams over the next week, and especially the next 2 weeks or so?
Well, I think that we'll see a little more of the silver run, and these big bears staying up here, and I think some of the more dominant females as well. But we're seeing more and more bears on the lower river. So there will be more action on the lower river. And also, I expect that some of the bears who have been on their August walkabout will return.